Gotham Knights has some big shoes to fill. The last major Batman-themed title was Batman Arkham Knight, an early last-gen game that pushed graphical and gameplay boundaries. Even today, the game still impresses, with a gritty, rain-soaked rendition of Gotham City swarming with criminals. So is Gotham Knights similarly impressive? Unfortunately, early footage has seen mixed reactions, with critics complaining of robotic combat and mediocre visuals. Equally concerning has been several recent developments. A few months ago, the last-gen console versions of the game were abruptly cancelled, and last week it was announced that Gotham Knights would only support 30 FPS gameplay on current-gen machines. Arkham Knight developer Rocksteady is off for this one, so it's up to WB Games Montreal, the developer of 2013's Batman Arkham Origins, to deliver a polished superhero experience. So is this a worthy successor to Arkham Knight despite all the controversy? And what exactly is going on with performance? On first inspection, Gotham Knights is a bit underwhelming. This is a thoroughly last-gen title in terms of its basic visual makeup. Expect to see decent-looking PBR materials, a big GI system, and extensive TAA coverage. Even relative to 8th gen standards though, this isn't great stuff. Characters and other dynamic objects often stick out dramatically from the environment, for instance, lacking any sort of cohesion within the GI system. This is a common issue when dealing with big GI, of course, but the results here are often poor. Just look at the enemy on the ground here, for instance, or the back of the player character. When lots of dynamic lights are on screen, there's a closer match between the lighting systems as would be expected, but under primarily indirect lighting, the results can look odd. There are other issues with the lighting and shadowing. Ambient occlusion is quite restrained here, so geometry doesn't seem grounded very effectively within the environment. Specular highlights are another concern, which are often misaligned with the objects on screen. This tends to stick out quite a bit here, as the game world is always dark and rain-slicked, in typical Batman fashion. Now, these aren't huge issues taken individually, but they do make Gotham City feel disjointed. Overall, the city feels quite clinical and much less stylized than you would expect. Gotham has a certain visual signature in other media, a version of New York City with an emphasis on older architectural styles, often portrayed at night and with heavy rain. Here, Gotham doesn't distinguish itself from cities in other open-world titles. The city layout itself is wide open and modern, with broad avenues, a simple grid layout, and contemporary building styles. Objects in the far distance are often quite easy to see given the lack of smoke and other visual obstructions. Most galling, however, is the lack of rain. If you look very closely, you can spot rain in most outdoor scenarios, but it's almost unbelievably faint, never rising to anything above a mild drizzle. Gotham Knights' visual design just doesn't make much sense, especially considering how the city is depicted in other games, which we will touch on in a few moments. This is a pretty serious and grimy game that takes place after Batman has been killed, so the clean and somewhat generic look just doesn't feel appropriate. But there are aspects of the visuals that do work well. Oddly enough, for an open-world title, interior spaces are a highlight. These areas are very detailed and feel like a closer match for the Batman aesthetic, with grimy corridors and moody volumetrics. The art and design can impress, like the neon-soaked archways of the Iceberg Lounge. It's definitely still mired firmly in cross-gen tech here, but the results are at least consistent with expectations for a big-budget release. Asset quality is quite high in certain areas across the game, especially indoors. This evidence locker is packed with geometric detail and variety, for instance. On close inspection, most of the assets in closed-off zones hold up very well. Clearly, a lot of effort went into putting these areas together. Geometric and texture detail takes a bit of a hit in the open world, as you might expect, though at typical viewing distances there are no issues. Plus, player and enemy models are generally very high quality. My overall impression of Gotham Knights is that it is less than the sum of its parts. A lot of time and hard work has clearly been poured into this game, but strange design choices, odd technical hangups, and a lack of aesthetic commitment make the final product underwhelm. Evaluated on its own terms, Gotham Knights is a generic and unexciting game that has its moments, but that ultimately falls well behind the curve for an open world title. But many people aren't evaluating Gotham Knights on its own. They're comparing it to Arkham Knight, Rocksteady's last-gen classic, and the deficiencies of this game become extremely obvious when measured up against that title. Arkham Knight's Gotham City is a mess of dense, centuries-old stonework and narrow roads, bathed in smoke and drenched with rain. Gotham Knights has a much more generic atmosphere in contrast. Certain differences immediately stick out, like rain effects, which come down thick and interact nicely with lighting in the earlier title, and are virtually non-existent now. The atmospheric effects and fog have been carefully crafted to make for a convincing skyline, with certain elements, like window lights, managing to pierce through. Gotham Knights' distant detail looks like a soupy mess in contrast. I'm comparing the games here on PS5, running the PS4 code for Arkham Knights under backwards compatibility. Even the basic city design just feels off. There's little in the way of industrial activity, the street layouts are basically the same as any other open world city, and specific Batman visual signatures, like zeppelins flying overhead or a dramatically oversized moon, appear to be absent. I suppose a lot of this will come down to taste, but it's remarkable that Gotham Knights presents an open world environment that's difficult to distinguish from other recent releases, especially when Arkham Knight showed such incredible confidence and vision. Put the games side by side here, and Gotham Knights just looks lifeless, and that's actually literally true as well. Arkham Knight was swarming with gangs of criminals and fleeing pedestrians. You couldn't get very far on foot without being confronted by gangs of enemies ransacking the city. Gotham Knights is so devoid of life by comparison that I could drive around for minutes without spotting anything other than the occasional civilian. It's a pretty remarkable change and it feels very odd. Comparing individual effects and models between the two titles, Arkham Knight still manages to hold its ground. Take the water for example. Arkham had stunning, tech demo style tessellated water, with an extremely high level of geometric detail, realistic foam textures, and convincing looking swells. It beautifully fit Gotham's perpetually stormy state, and it's up there with the best looking video game water even today, over 7 years after the game's release. Gotham Knights water looks okay, but is much less pleasing by comparison. The waves don't really crest and have a weak sense of wind direction, seeming to sort of undulate up and down independent of the weather. The water's surface is smooth and lacks much detail, relying heavily on textures. It's par for the course for water in games nowadays, sadly, but it doesn't come anywhere near the singular beauty of the turbulent seas in Arkham Knight. Gotham Knights does score some wins if you measure assets side by side, however. Arkham's texture work still looks perfectly fine, but surfaces generally do showcase higher res 2D art in Gotham Knights. Chalk this up to running with access to extra memory perhaps, or possibly the more limited asset variety in Gotham Knights is helping somewhat. Interiors in general showcase less granular detail in Arkham Knight as well, though as mentioned before this is a high point for Gotham Knight's visuals. I would be remiss not to mention TAA as well, which is present in Gotham Knights and absent from Arkham. Unreal Engine 4 has a very capable and refined TAA, which cleans up the image quite nicely here and pairs with a higher rendering resolution to create a solid final picture. Arkham Knight predated the widespread use of TAA and has a post-process AA solution instead, producing messy results. So visually, I would say that Arkham Knight is the more accomplished title. It showcases a much more coherent and attractive world, with beautiful environmental art and design. It's a shame that Arkham never received any sort of PS4 Pro or One X enhancement, current gen release, or properly functioning PC version. But even in this diminished state, it squares off quite nicely against a very similar game that is 7 years newer. And that applies to gameplay as well, sadly. Gotham Knights is a somewhat clunky combat system that I never really felt very connected to over my hours of play. It's functional and most of the basics of melee fighting are present and accounted for, but it doesn't flow very well. Animation is a relative low point here, as character movement often looks jilted and odd. Arkham has beautiful, perfectly flowing combat that I instantly understood as soon as I started playing. The game's combat system is built around fending off large groups of enemies, deflecting individual attacks while zipping from foe to foe. Batman responds instantly to player input, but the animations still manage to convince. I found it much more compelling upon a brief revisit than Gotham Knights. Arkham Knight's key gameplay change relative to prior entries was the introduction of the Batmobile, a sleek but powerful vehicle for Batman to use in enemy pursuits. Gotham Knights similarly features the Bat Cycle, a slimmer and two-wheeled variant that has similar features, but this is a much less compelling gameplay device. The Batmobile navigated Gotham in a haphazard sort of way. Arkham Knight City was snaked with winding roads and narrow alleys, so getting the Batmobile into position often required fast turns and seat-of-your-pants driving. The vehicle suspension came alive, and anything you hit Cars, fences, even stone barriers and columns would break apart in a shower of sparks and rubble. Gotham Knights' Bat-Cycle is boring by comparison. The broader, more conventional city layout in this game means that this new bike is much less exciting to drive. Most of the time you'll be going down straight roads with minimal obstruction. Turning feels odd as the camera feels almost glued to the back of the bike. The game doesn't let you really feel the back slide out with a less responsive camera like in Arkham Knight. The sense of speed in Gotham Knight is lessened dramatically from Arkham as a result of these changes, alongside reduced motion blur compared to the earlier title. The corners of the screen do get a speed arrows 2D effect overlaid to enhance the feeling of velocity, but I found it distracting and I wish there was a toggle to turn it off. If you compare the two games side by side, however, the two vehicles are traveling at similar speeds. It does look like the Batmobile is a touch faster, but it's not a huge difference. Most of the differences in apparent speed here come down to design and changes in post-processing. In any case, the Bat-Cycle makes for a poor replacement. In most respects, Gotham Knights falls well short of its predecessor. It's a serviceable action title with unsatisfying visuals, without the gameplay or visual flair that made Arkham Knight so unique. But there is a lot more to talk about, because we've yet to discuss the game's performance. Before we touch on frame rates, let's quickly run through the rendering setups across current-gen consoles. PS5 and Series X both manage a 4K presentation, rendering at 2160p pixel count at maximum, while Series S comes in at 1440p. Dynamic resolution is definitely a possibility, though I didn't encounter it in my testing. Overall image quality is very good on all machines. I have zero complaints here really. All versions of Gotham Knights look smooth, stable, and clean, with an excellent handling of distant detail. Even Series S looks great, and appears surprisingly comparable to the premium machines in still shots. The primary difference is a little bit of visible edge aliasing on Series S at times, a minimal amount of additional image breakup, and somewhat less detail, though this is hard to notice from typical viewing distances. Outside of resolution, the predominant visual difference is the addition of ray-traced reflections on Series X and PS5. These are high quality and apply to most reflective surfaces, adding an extra layer of depth. Even the ocean surface gets RT reflections here, though it looks somewhat noisy as you might expect. Examined up close, they generally resolve with a good level of detail and seem to reflect a reasonably complex version of the environment. I did notice that certain screen space details were overlaid on reflective surfaces when available, enhancing the final resolve of the reflection. Series S, as expected, falls back to the last-gen staples, cube maps plus screen space reflections. The results look reasonably high quality, though stability takes a backseat to the RT implementation. I did notice a couple of small oddities though when comparing PS5 to the Xbox Series consoles. UI elements seemed slightly larger on PS5, despite using identical settings across both machines. Plus, certain windowed rooms seem to be using different cube maps for their interior mapping on PS5 than Xbox Series S and X, which is strange but probably doesn't amount to anything more than a minor curiosity. With that out of the way, how does Gotham Knights actually run? True to the developer's word, we're getting just one visual mode here. There are no graphical settings tweaks available outside of color correction. That should mean 30 FPS gameplay, at least on paper. Well, it is true that Gotham Knights targets 30 FPS, but Gotham Knights is constantly beset by frame rate drops, stutters, and frame time fluctuations. Driving around the city provides the best stress test. Here we see a mix of 50 and 33 millisecond frames while under duress, with sudden frame time spikes and 16 millisecond readings at times. It's an extremely unstable and ugly experience. We're seeing constant frame time fluctuations, combined with big performance drops, down to a minimum of about 25 FPS or so. I'm describing performance across all platforms here, as the consoles perform more or less identically. Any sort of combat or traversal on foot around Gotham City can cause the same issues. The frame time spikes are more of an issue with faster traversal, but frame persistence issues and more conventional performance drops are common. Interiors fare somewhat better, with fewer of the large performance drops, though the odd frame time issues persist. Perhaps these areas stress the game's core rendering systems less, or trigger fewer issues with streaming. In any case, this is as good as it gets, though it's still unacceptably unstable. Perhaps the worst frame rates I encountered were in the train terminals. I was able to get performance to collapse here, with lows around 20 FPS. There's no clear reason for this, although I was able to tank frame rates across multiple runs through multiple terminals on the Xbox Series X. I didn't have any luck, however, in replicating this behavior on the Series S or PS5, so perhaps this one issue is Series X specific, or only emerges after a specific trigger. Really though, performance in this game is unacceptable. It seems like we're getting a mix of smaller frame time problems, which should be fixable, along with issues with stuttering and prolonged frame rate dips, which may prove more fundamentally challenging. Given this game's development issues, I doubt these are the sorts of problems that can be quickly addressed, though I'd love to be proven wrong. At the moment, Gotham Knights can't even deliver a stable 30 FPS, falling well short of expectations for a cross-gen title. And I do say cross-gen here, because the technology is thoroughly cross-gen in nature. All the rendering features, with the exception of RT reflections on the premium consoles, would find a comfortable home on last-gen hardware. Loading screens are still present even when traveling between the open world and mission briefings or combat arenas. It's hard to see how Gotham Knights would have worked on the planned last-gen console versions, however, given the poor performance here. So here's my advice. If you want to play a Batman game, go back to the 7th and 8th gen Batman titles in the Arkham series. Every one of those games, especially the excellent Arkham Knight, is a solid experience. Gotham Knights, in contrast, is beset by bland visual design, dull gameplay, and horrible performance. There are some bright spots in the mix, but my overall impression is that this game needs a very substantial reworking before it's worth your time. Given the amount of effort that has been sunk into making this game, perhaps that could still happen. But for now, I'd recommend staying away. If you enjoyed this video, please like, subscribe, and press the bell for YouTube notifications. Check out the Patreon at digitalfoundry.net for exclusive and early access content. And to get in touch, just use Twitter. Thanks for watching.